Good morning. Welcome to the third and final webinar in our AAWHG Webinar series. My name is Brian Greaves and I'm the Deputy Chair as well as representing the Australian Airline Pilots Association, AUSALPA, on the executive. I mention this because one of the strengths of our group is that we have members from all parts of the industry and government. Ash, our chair, will tell you that wildlife hazard management is the responsibility of everyone involved. Does not lie with one stakeholder, such as the airport, and is a shared responsibility. Pilots, operators, air traffic controllers, aerodrome operations and safety officers, consultants, ornithologists, research scientists, regulators, safety investigators, governments, local and national, all need to play their part to effectively mitigate the risks associated with wildlife hazards to aviation. The key word is collaboration, and that's the theme of today's webinar. How these different groups can bring their unique skills and expertise to work together to manage wildlife hazards effectively. Shared responsibility starts with the National Bird Strike Committee, expanded to all wildlife hazards, having representation from all the stakeholders listed above, and some that I may not have mentioned. By working together and understanding each other's issues, a common strategy and guidance can be developed, which can then be used by each of the stakeholders to develop their own wildlife hazard management plan, as we'll see during this session. AUSALPA, together with the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations, IFALPA, advocate that wildlife mitigation training should be incorporated into the pilots' licenses syllabi and into the operator training along with tailored SOPs. This view is shared by the group and is reflected in our recommended practices, which are available on the website aawhg.org. Dr. Thomas Lenny from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and a member of our executive will present data on wildlife strikes in Australia. This data, which is available on the ATS website, can be used by operators to help assess the risk of operating to a particular airport and to provide information to the crews, along with NOTAMs, specific entries in the aeronautical information publications, and other real-time wildlife updates. The pilot or crew can then decide on the appropriate mitigation, such as delaying takeoff, carrying more fuel, holding, delaying landing, requesting a different runway. If this sounds familiar, it should be, as this is exactly what we as pilots do for weather hazards, so why not for wildlife? These were the predictive and tactical actions described by Simon Locke in the Qantas Group's COVID-19 approach to wildlife hazards, and the example of bats at one airport, which we heard on the last webinar last week. It's still surprising that whilst pilots are taught to identify clouds, such as cumulonimbus, and understand the severe weather phenomena associated with them, most would have no idea what the word pteropus means. I'm certainly no smarter than the average bear, boo-boo, but thanks to the experts around me in the AAWHG, I now understand its meaning and realize that we pilots should have an equally healthy respect for and understanding of the genus of megabats, large bats, commonly known as flying foxes or fruit bats. By the way, Margot tells me that the word comes from the ancient Greek, pteron, wing, and pous, meaning foot. According to the Atsb Wildlife Strike Report, over the 10 years between 2008 and 2017, 464 flying fox strikes and 582 bat strikes were reported to the Atsb. The report says, it's likely, however, that many of the strikes involving animals reported as bats actually involve flying foxes. If that is the case, it makes pteropus at a possible 1046 the most commonly struck species, ahead of galahs at 801. This emphasizes the need for education and training and the importance of accurate data in driving our wildlife mitigation measures. It also highlights the importance of accurate species identification, which can be achieved by carefully collecting the remains and sending them for DNA analysis, as explained by Dr. Matt Lott in his excellent informative presentation in Webinar 1. Last week, Dan Parsons provided an extremely interesting presentation on using time series analysis of data to show that the ICAO prediction of increased strikes resulting from the COVID impacts was valid, thus providing a warning for all airports about to open again. Today, he will provide another entertaining and somewhat quirky presentation, if you excuse me saying so, on wildlife hazard event reporting improvements, which is also the serious focus of his PhD thesis, and hopefully end up having some impact on the revision of the IBIS manual, which Lolita mentioned in her presentation at the beginning of this series. Renaud Yit, Principal Environment Scientist, Regional Manager, Aviation, will present on the close collaboration for almost 10 years between a wildlife consultancy and the agency responsible for the Wildlife Hazard Management Plan and its implementation at the Royal Australian Air Force Base, Edinburgh, a military airport near Adelaide in South Australia. I'm now delighted to welcome our first two guest speakers from Indonesia, Captain Ahmad Sanakin Abdurrahman, Corporate Safety Director, PT Indonesia AirAsia, and Mr. Yusron Saroni, an ornithologist from Yayasan Pribumi Alam Lestari. Apologies for the pronunciation. Thank you for joining us this early hour. Salamat pagi. Thank you. In their presentation, they will share some initiatives of collaborative efforts by aviation stakeholders and uniting the missing puzzle with non-direct aviation stakeholders. They will explain that mitigation actions have been taken involving a few scientists. However, the wildlife bird strike occurrences are still quite high in Indonesia. They will describe the pilot scheme at 4 Indonesian airports to trial better mitigation measures, which can then be implemented nationally. In summary, they will contend that more intensive, holistic, and collaborative efforts need to be enhanced to re-establish ecosystems analysis and determine the effectiveness of mitigation as stated in the Wildlife Hazard Management Program. They have entitled their presentation, Sharing the Skies, Stitching the Missing Puzzles. Some of you will know that sharing the skies was a mantra of the late and dearly missed Bruce McKinnon from Canada, who made such a huge contribution to wildlife mitigation globally. There is no better memorial to Bruce than to know his work is being carried out through the contributions of our eminent speakers today and those in the previous webinars. Before I ask Sadakin and Yusron to speak, just a reminder, with this combined wealth of expertise in this webinar, please make sure that you ask questions using the Q&A panel on the right of your screen. We have dedicated time to pose as many of these as possible to our presenters, so please don't miss the opportunity to clarify or expand on the points in their presentations. Over to you, Sadakin and Yusron.
Thank you, Brian, for the introductions. It is a great honor for us to be invited in the AAWHG Annual Forum. We would like to sincerely thank you for Ashley McAlpine as the chairman of the AAWHG and also the entire AAWHG team for the opportunity for us to share our experience and hopefully to work collaboratively on the wildlife hazard management in the near future. In this opportunity, we would like to share our initiatives and observation summary with the support of the Agency of Research and Development Center of Air Transportation and support of Directorate of Airports, Directorate General of Civil Aviation, Ministry of Transportation Indonesia. We are also here on behalf of Steering Committee of National Forum of Indonesia Aviation Wildlife Hazard Management, which consists of regulators, air operators, air navigation service providers, the Indonesian Institute of Science, and few environmental and conservation organizations. This national forum is in the process to get our government acknowledgement. The background of this initiative is triggered by a few serious incidents happened in year 2013 and 2014, where we had bird strikes event that impacted a huge amount of money for engine parts and engine replacements. Not only the cost impact, but it was potentially high risk of event if we don't take this seriously. The objective of our presentation is to share our experience as a small team in gathering information, data, and reconnecting the missing puzzles for the wildlife hazard management implementations. We hope you can also learn from the AAWHG on establishing and running the organizations to be partner of government in supporting the effective implementation of wildlife management program. Next slide. Okay, this is the content of our presentations. Next slide. Next. Okay, as you may know that Indonesia is an archipelago country which has 17,000 islands with approximately 1.9 million square kilometers big, approximately 24% smaller than Australia continent. But we are the second most biodiverse countries in the world by Mongabe.com. Indonesia currently has 252 airports, which managed directly by Ministry of Transportations, 179 of UPBU, and the Ministry of State-Owned Enterprise is managing the 15 by AP1, Angkasa Pura 1, and 20 airports by Angkasa Pura 2 or AP2. The rest is managed by local government and few private entities, 37 by UPTD, and 1 is by BP in Batam. Next slide.
Okay. The International Weather Study Group defined that Indonesia is within the World Bird Migratory Flyway, that is the East Asian Australian Flyway, one of the world's great flyways. The East Asian Australian Flyway is home to over 50 million migratory water birds from over 250 different populations, including 32 globally threatened species and 90 near-threatened species.
Next slide.
Okay. During migration, water birds rely on a system highly productive wetland to rest and feed, building up sufficient energy to fuel the next phase of their journey. East Asian Australian Flyway Partnership identified 1,060 sites as internationally important for migratory birds. The sites are called Flyway Site Network. Next slide.
Next slide. Okay, next. Click. Okay, in these collaborative actions, we refer to the international regulations and guidance as such as Annex 14 for the ICAO Doc 9981, ICAO Doc 9137, and a few national regulations. There is the Indonesian Aviation Law number 1 here 2009, and also the few national regulations, and also CSR 139 and other related regulation and policies. Next slide. Next. Okay. This is where the journey begins. In the mid-year 2014, with other Indonesian delegation led by Pak Agustono from the Directorate of Airports, we had attended the AAWHG Annual Forum in Melbourne. We had a lot of information and perspective on managing wildlife hazard in the airport. In the following months, in December 2014, next click, we organized a workshop which attended by related stakeholders, airport operators, regulators, KNKT, airport operators, and also scientists from few universities, bird and ecological expertise, and also we from local government who handle the natural resources conservation and ecosystem. We also had a special guest from Australian Embassy and the Air Service Australia. With this one-day workshop, we had a few conclusion and agreement. Click, please. Which following that we have to follow up the previous wildlife hazard meeting recommendations. And from this workshop, we also defined as an embryo to establishing a national forum on aviation wildlife management. The third one, we defining programs and action plans. And the last agreement that we conclude in the meeting is to gain government acknowledgement for this national forum establishment. Unfortunately, this initiative was postponed for a few years because of our tragic incident in 2014. Next slide. Until in year 2019, we then re-establishing the activities by gathering more information, data, discussion with few airlines, airport operators, biologists, ornithologists, and expertise from the Indonesian Institute of Scientists or LIPI. Next click. We also followed by discussion with Kuala Lumpur Airport in Medan with stakeholders from AP2, AirNav, the air navigation provider, and also few stakeholders in Medan. Next slide. In the following month, we then went to the Medan again to observe the airport surrounding and within perimeter as well. With the support of local expertise, we get the better understanding on the ecosystem contributions, the mudflat, rice plantation, and habitat to the existence of the most water birds in Kaino Airport. As you see on the right bottom, there are few points of mudflat surrounding the Kaino Airport in Medan. Next slide. In the following year, 2020, in the very beginning, and where we can have a limitation on field observation and offline discussions, we met also few stakeholders, the head of Research Development Center for Air Transportations, the Director General of Natural Resource Conservation and Ecosystem. We met also the local team for Natural Resource Conservation and Ecosystem, airport operators, air navigation providers, local bird expertise, and few focus group discussion held by Research and Development Center in Air Transportations. In the following years, this 2021, in a restrictive offline activity, we keep maintaining the coordinations, share knowledge, information experience by the virtual meeting or VidCon. Next slide. This is the main part that we are focusing on is on the data. This is the data collecting from the 6 major airlines in Indonesia from year 2017 until 2020. There were 180 safety reports on bird strikes and hazard where we received, which majority of it, the 149 occurrence or 83%, are the bird struck the aircraft, which resulted in minor and major damage to the aircraft. The minor one, the 31 reports or 17%, were bird hazard. That is the bird presence in the vicinity of the aircraft, just on the runway, taxiway, apron, and surrounding the aircraft. As you can see, there are top 10 bird strikes report in Indonesia. Next slide. Okay, in this picture, you can see the bird strike and hazard comparison, where we collected from 2017. It is very low because it collects from one airlines only, but the following years, we collect from the rest of the 6 major airlines. As you can see, that incremental trends was happened. And within the growth of prediction based on previous year 2019, and with the approximately 70% reductions in 2020 fleets, we can see the numbers are increased. Next. This is the flight phase on the bird strike occurrences, mostly during approach, takeoff run, and also the landing rolls. Next slide. In this picture, we see that the bird strike impact of the aircraft, the blue bars is no damage to the aircraft. The orange is showing the minor damage to the aircraft, and the purple is where we define the major damage, where bird struck the aircraft and causing the aircraft parts damage, or even the aircraft has to be AOG or on ground. Next slide. Yes, this is the summary of the mapping on strike of the aircraft surface area. As you can see, the most strikes were on the engine, about 37 reports, and followed by windshield and radome. Next. So this is where I mentioned in the opening, the trigger on 2013 and 2014, where the bird struck the aircraft, causing the major engine parts and also the major engine replacement. There is the direct cost of the impact, about 100,000 million US dollar on the left, and about $8 million US dollars for the engine replacements. And the recent incident happened in Batam on the right bottom corner, where the Eagles species were struck the engine for Citylink, and also the Lion Air aircraft happened in Batam. Next slide. This is the sample of minor struck in various parts. The main landing gear and also the engine fan blade happened in Medan, years 2019. Next.
Okay. And of Q3 and Q4 year 2020 field observation to 4 major airports in Medan, Jakarta, Bali, and Yogyakarta. About the diversity of observation from August until November 2020 using a transect and vantage point method. Ecological and bird behavior observation on habitat, food and roosting, and behavior, flying pattern, regular and activity. Next. The 2020 field observation summary, the bird counting from August until November 2020 for Jakarta, Bali, and Medan, and New Yogyakarta Airport. Period 1, August-September, observed of 90 species, including 15 migratory birds. Period 2, October until November, observed of 117 species, including 30 migratory and 44 important birds. Next. The important bird species counting at Jakarta, Bali, and Medan, and New Yogyakarta Airport. Next slide. Okay, same. Next slide. This is the hotspot of in the airport while grass cutting, vegetation on the runway and on the tarmac. Next. Risk analysis, which has been performed by forestry faculty team from University of ITB Bogor in year 2018 using the risk matrix based on severity on probability on occurrence. Next. Other methodology on ranking the bird hazard. Snowden method using species characteristic in defining the severity of risk. The airline methods using bird species, numbers, location, and behavior in identification and classification of risk.
Okay, just to add on what Yusran said, that between these three methodology, the risk matrix that using by IPB, and also the second method from other expertise, we define that the summary of methodology is using by our team is using the special matrix. Next click, please. Next click. Next click, please. Ashley. Would you please click the slide? Okay, supposed to be shown in the yellow box that our team is combining the formula. Next click. So between these three methodologies, we define the risk by combining locations, which is the L times a weight of bird, BB plus populations and vertical flying path capability. So with this combined formula and combining also with the risk of matrix, we then define from various findings from the airports Bali, Jakarta, Medan, and also Yogyakarta. From the finding that we observed birds that we found and also their metrics. With the next slide, we can show that the view birds are in the high, medium, or low risk. Next slide, please.
Okay. From the defining formula, we categorize the risk analysis of each airport as follows. This is the Jakarta Airport, Cengkareng. Has for high-grade species, Ardea speciosa, Cucurbus ibis, Ardea intermedia, Ardea purpurea. Okay, next. Next slide, please.
Okay. In the next slide, it will shows the pictures of the birds. Yes, and also we define from the information what is the behavior of these particular birds that have high and also medium risk to the airports.
Okay. Next slide, please.
Bali.
Okay, in Bali, Denpasar International Airport, Bali has two high-risk species, Cucurbus ibis and Pulpo peregrinus. Pulpo peregrinus is a raptor, migratory raptor. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please.
Yeah, the following slide is similar to the Jakarta. Is the picture of the birds that we observe and also their behavior that we are observing within the airport of Bali. Next slide. Yeah.
Okay, in Medan, Kuala Namu International Airport has 5 high-grade species, Gradiola maldivarum, Cucurbus ibis, Ardea purpurea, Cadadrius mongolus, this species migratory bird, and Elanus perilus, one of the raptor. Okay, next. Next slide. That's a picture of the behavior in kennel. Okay. Next slide, please. In Yogyakarta, next. Okay. In Yogyakarta, has 3 high-grade species, Cucurbus ibis, Cadadrius mongolus, and Harris indus. Okay. Next, thank you.
Okay. As you can see, beside the observation that we are had in the 4 selected airports, Medan, Jakarta, Bali, and also Yogyakarta, we also highlighting issues to the airport stakeholders on the importance of situational awareness, where everyone should aware and not disregarding the situation where the flock of birds are present in the vicinity of the aircraft. Pilots and ATC should notice and inform, and then ground personnel team, that is the AMC or other appointed team, should take necessary actions to get the birds away from the active aircraft. This is the example that we take from Jakarta and also Manado, where you can see the flock of birds are in the vicinity of the aircraft who are ready to take off. Next slide. Yes, this is what I mentioned before, the importance of data. The second priority that we are focusing is data. Now we are encouraging and utilizing the mandatory and voluntary report channels where our state safety program team is now enhancing the reporting system and encouraging stakeholders to capitalize the system. The daily observation log by our airport operator and also the ATC are being encouraged to be more active and regularly analyze and review. The presence of dashboard also is being populated to give better visibility on the important on the subject and issue. So this is the second priority of data where we also addressing to the airport operator and also ATC. Next slide. Yes, this is the one of the temporary output that we are currently doing. That all the data has been gathered, analyzed, and should be more encouraged on the bird or NOTAM. So where in this NOTAM, pilots can enhance their situational awareness, and also we are planning to have a training on bird identification, behavior, and assessment are crucial for assign wildlife hazard personnel. And to get more qualified person in the airport, by this training, who also lies with local expertise. The most important area also we are coordinating is the regular coordination meeting is being encouraged. We now have the runway safety team to optimize this regular or monthly meeting among stakeholders in the airport. Next slide. Okay, the other important output that we are encouraging is the correct and effective mitigation and methodology. Because at the moment in various airports like Jakarta, they have quite a lot of tools in place like weather radar, a laser, and few other tools. But the way that before that they have not implementing the system, it seems it is not effective. But by this collaborative action, we are now encourage them by data and also by talking with local expertise. We can define what is the effective ways. Like you can see on the left corner of the bottom, the combination of methodology using laser and also flag movement in Medan, it is effective to get away bird near the airport or near the aircraft where the active runway is being used. The recent activity that we are involving is on the right top box of the picture is the ecological analysis using the mapping of the usage of the field around the airport to mitigate the ecosystem and habitual. The rest that we are now considering is maybe we can use the what you call raptor or also a dog on getting away the bird in the airport, but it is still in the analysis. Next slide. Next, yeah. This is the roadmap that we are now defining within the small team, the steering committee. Since 2018, we start our stage 1 on for the identification, observation, and data collection analysis. And we hope at the moment we are entering the stage 2 and stage 3, where communication, discussion, and collaborations are in place. And also we are establishing the steering committee of the National Forum. We are now also defining the working group, and we are planning to have a few training for the training personnel in the airport. Stage 4, maybe next year and the following year, we are planning to have more collaborative activities and national forum, and to also establish the National Forum Committee, hopefully by next year. And the last stage, where we are hoping that the sustainability of the committee is taking place in support of government program in managing aviation wildlife hazard. Next slide. Yes, this is the thing that we are called the uniting puzzles because at the previous years, few stakeholders are missing. By this collaborative initiative, we are hoping the holistic approach and also collaborative actions where 5 major puzzles are collaborate. First part is authorities from aviation and also from the environmental entities. The second puzzles is from the air operators, where airlines, air charter, and general aviations are involved. The third puzzles is the airport operator. Indonesia, we have 4 entities like AP1, AP2, governmental owned company. And the fourth puzzle is ATC, or the Air Navigation Service Provider, where Airnav Indonesia is the only ANSP Indonesia. And the last part, and also the missing puzzle that we are having previously, is the scientists, where the Indonesian Institute of Science and local universities and NGO is now being populated and being collaborated. Next click, please. So hopefully by this collaborative action, all 4 or 5 entities is now being gathered and collaborate, and hopefully we can enhance our mitigation and also implementation on the wildlife hazard management. Next slide. Okay, we believe that unity is the strength. When there is a teamwork and collaboration, wonderful things can be achieved. Next slide. Okay, this is the end of our presentations. We should share our skies as the title of our presentations and live together with birds safely. And thank you again for having us in this webinar. And thank you again for AAWHG for having us in these wonderful and fruitful sessions. I'm returning session to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Terima kasih. Very insightful presentation, which shows why collaboration is so important, not only for aviation stakeholders, but also for others whose actions may have a direct or indirect effect on wildlife activity at or around the airport. I'm very happy that, having done the introduction, that many of the points that I highlighted there, you have also highlighted in this excellent presentation. The need to accurately understand your risks through identifying the species that are most hazardous, using the analysis of data appropriately, and then sharing it. And those NOTAMs for pilots are exactly what we're looking for. Fantastic, and I really hope we see those rolled out here in Australia and elsewhere around the region, if not around the world. And looking at what are the effective mitigation measures, it's very easy to get caught up and do a mitigation measure which we think is working but actually isn't. And finally, you'll move to have a National Bird Strike Committee with all the stakeholders. Really a great step forward for Indonesia. I know from my own experience, I've been to Indonesia quite a few times and been there assisting with runway safety and so forth. And often you come away thinking, well, we just spoke about that last year, but nothing has changed. But now I can really see that there are some substantial changes being made, which is excellent. I know 3 of the airports pretty well: Jakarta, Denpasar, particularly, which I used to operate into, Yogyakarta, which I've visited. But what you've shown are relatively large, if not the largest airports in the country. Could I ask the 2 of you now, would this work for a smaller airport? Are you going to be able to roll out this sort of program for them?
Yes, Brian. At the moment, together with the government, we just have the initiative also to involve the what you call the UPBU and UPTD. It is the smaller airport in the region, where we already been there last 2 weeks in Bima Airport, where it's a small airport, only have 4 fleet a day. So by the other 4 major airport, we also define 2 airport, Bima and also Batam. the medium airport. Hopefully by this pilot project airport, where we are establishing the templates and also the management of wildlife hazard, and then we can duplicate to other smaller airport. But we are on the way to the small airport also.
Okay, thank you. The other question I was going to ask you, Sadikin, is last week we heard from Simon Locke talking about the Qantas Group focus, and I mentioned it before, but one of the things that, if you like, COVID-19 has made the Qantas Group really focus on is the collaboration between airlines, air operators, and the airports. So obviously AirAsia, you driving it, have been a major contributor towards this. But what about the other airlines and air operators? How have you managed to get them on side to assist with this?
Yes, at the moment, I am quite a lot of involved on the initiative, but behind the scene, we also been supported by other major airlines by data and also the collaborative or discussions. Maybe if the committee is being established, so we can have more involvement of other airlines as well, directly to the field, I mean.
Okay, great, thank you. So Terima kasih, Sadikin and Yusran, please stay on the line, as they say, as I'm sure there'll be some more questions for you when we have the panel discussion at the end.
Thank you.
So our next presentation is a decade of aviation wildlife hazard management at the Royal Australian Air Force Base, Edinburgh. I was in the Royal Air Force, and here in Australia they always call it RAF, and it kind of really hurts me because in the UK we never use RAF, so the RAAF Edinburgh. As I explained in my introduction, Raphael will provide an overview of the aviation wildlife hazard management program at the Royal Australian Air Force Base, Edinburgh. Sadly, as I said, Giles injured his foot just before this. I'm sure it wasn't just to get out of the presentation. Aviation has set up and implemented this program at Edinburgh under Raphael's leadership for more than 10 years. And from Edinburgh, the program has been adopted at other RAAF bases. So the presentation includes a program overview, the key players, comparisons between military and civil aviation wildlife hazard management, and the program successes and challenges. In particular, the presentation will outline the risk trends and the various integrated management approaches. Thank you, and over to you, Raphael.
Thank you very much, Brian. Just for the facilitators and the audience, Giles Standish, who was supposed to present with me from Ventia, has passed his apology, and sorry, Brian, not foot injury, he's unwell with the chest infection illness. Just to correct that. Moving on, thanks to the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group for the opportunity for me to present in this forum, and also the participants for attending this forum, mainly for the common goal, which is for the aviation safety. And yeah, basically we are talking about collaboration and shared responsibility, and that's kind of the one of the main themes sort of my presentation has got, and what I have learned from 10 years of facilitating and managing wildlife hazard programs at military aviation establishments. And I'm using RAF Base Edinburgh as the model. So basically, I would like to start with the acknowledgement of the country. So Aviation and Ventia acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we work. We pay deep respect to our elders, past and present, who hold the songlines and dreaming of this country on which we work. We honor and support the continuation of cultural, spiritual, and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this nation. So basically, just a bit of a background on the Defence Aviation Wildlife Hazard Management Strategy. So this is basically all started about more than 10 years ago now. And I think main thing was to embark on something, we need a good strategy. So this is basically what has happened. In the year 2012, 2011, 2012, sort of, people from the office from the Air Force, TSG at that time, which is State Infrastructure Group, and the subject matter experts, this was Aviation, got together and developed a national strategy to implement aviation wildlife hazard management program of high-risk military aerodromes. And we are here basically carrying out aerodrome-based wildlife hazard management programs. And one of the things which we call like limited separation approach is mainly like terminal-based, so that what we can manage everything within the terminal airspace of an aerodrome. And most of the time it is airside to a little bit of extension from airside boundary fence. So that is all underway at a number of military bases at RAF Edinburgh, East Sale, Point Cook, and Embley, and also at RAF Tyndall. And also the strategy outlined, if this is going, just looking at an extended separation approach, which is in submission and preparation. Mainly that's more integration of technologies to actually use in these programs, and also a fully integrated strike management system, which is like a futuristic model, which we just want, like a number of sort of aviation sort of aerodromes and basically organizations to take, including military and civil. And I'll look into those in detail later in the PowerPoint. So basically, I would like to start with the key achievements and initiatives in the last 10 years. And I think these were standing out to me. So basically, we have had 0 damaging strike airside to date, compared to 6 within the 2-year period, 2 years prior to sort of the implementation of the Aviation Wildlife Hazard Management Program at RAF Edinburgh. And as I mentioned, Defence Aviation Wildlife National Wildlife Management Strategy was workshopped at Edinburgh in 2012. And also the other sort of achievement is inclusion of Aviation Wildlife Hazard Management, or WHMP, requirement in Operational Airworthiness Regulation at that time, which is also called Defence Aviation Safety Regulation, DESA, which is managed basically managed by the Defence Aviation Safety Authority, which is similar to Civil Aviation Safety Authority if you look at it in the civil side of sort of Australian aviation programs. And first ever wildlife management officer setup was sort of established at that time, which called Sign Chaser 1, integrated into airside operations and taken up nationally. So basically, just for your information, I was the Chaser 1. So, so that's a very proud situation to be in. And now, like after 10 years, I'm presenting on what I have learned. And after Edinburgh, the Wildlife Hazard Management Program was set up at RAF base Embley, and my good colleague Ashley McAlpine was the base of at that time at Embley. And it was set up by Aviation and later implemented at other RAF bases. We also had little corrales detected from RAF Edinburgh as a roosting hotspot. So we used to have like 30,000 birds used to roost on site in summer, and they were highly destructive to the facilities, the environment, a lot of noise issues in the area, plus also, like they're one of the highest aviation safety risks. If you've got those many birds in a landside area in vicinity of an aerodrome and translating over the runway, imagine the risk around that time. And also to deal with this problem, there's a lot of sort of strategies implemented to get rid of little corals. And one of the sort of strategy is the land management programs, which Giles Standish from Ventia was going to elaborate more on, but I can cover that later in this presentation. So basically, a large number of Aleppo pine trees. So basically, pine nuts are one of the biggest attractant of corals on a base on the base at that time, and it was removed, basically to deter corals from the site, and that was a very large exercise. And also, what was done in the background was pest bird exclusion plan drafted for more than 50 buildings and hangars and implemented, which was basically this achieved the aviation wildlife strike risk outcome plus also zoonosis, that is like zoonotic disease exposure from exposure to bird feathers and feces to personnel. So basically achieving occupational health and safety outcomes at the same time. And as we talk about, this whole webinar is about collaboration, and this is what was achieved through occupational health and safety units as well. And also RAF-based Edinburgh, like first radar trial to track birds in Australian aviation establishment was done at RAF-based Edinburgh in the early days. The above led to risk mitigation at a nearby waste transfer station, because we could see birds trekking over the airfield, but we didn't know where they were going, or so basically, even to actually get the stakeholder who actually owned the property to collaborate, that was also served as an evidence and showed him where these birds are taking over the airfield and how much of risk it is. And it was all good outcome with that level of sort of technology involved and also collaboration from the stakeholder after getting them to understand the risk. And exclusion of wildlife management officer in the training simulator for new and training controllers at RAF Edinburgh 453 Squadron. So basically what happens if a new air traffic controller is sort of signed to Edinburgh, or even the trainees, just like all other airside vehicles, like there could be, like the RAF firefighting services, like emergency vehicles, and and then what they call the air traffic control vehicles, ranger vehicles, and the planes. There's also the wildlife management services vehicle and chaser operations integrated into there. So if chaser is trying to enter a runway and tell, like basically inform the pilot in command or the air traffic controller what the risks are and how to actually walk around with this, with the wildlife control vehicle, that's also sort of implemented in the, integrated in the simulator program for the trainees. And also what we did in the last few years, we hosted, a few years ago, the Ops Squadron from Royal New Zealand Air Force in August 2018 to see the program at Edinburgh and take the knowledge back to New Zealand to implement what we are doing over here. Wildlife Management Officer Services were also engaged in during Edinburgh Air Show with zero bird strike. And we have had examples from nationally, like if you look at even the Avalon Air Show with the C-17 bird strike, which we can see, like through early warning systems and management, those kind of things can be avoided, because air shows are very like high risk exercises as well. There's low level maneuvers, high speed involved, and if there's birds in the airspace, that can cause sort of some major damage to aircraft. So, and we had zero with all the sort of management strategies sort of implemented at that time. And then again, like going back to the theme of this collaboration, we were engaged in the airshow from the very planning stage. It's not just calling us there saying, do something, but, everything we were made to understand. We were part of the airshow planning and then implementation of the wildlife hazard management program on the day of the airshow. So basically, few points of difference between civil and military. Main ones are sort of legislation. It is governed by Defence Commonwealth legislation, and Defence will adopt state and territory policies and legislation where it does not conflicts with defence legislation. And they also sort of align with the ICAO standards, Annex 14 and similar. And also the main defence regulation is Defence Aviation Safety Regulation in the main military regulation for airworthiness and safety management system. Aircraft types, there are various. Basically, there are military fast jets involved, roulettes, just like PC-21s at the moment, which are used for training exercises to train new pilots in air shows and stuff. And also we have had introductions like P-8 Poseidons, the Boeing aircraft, and also F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. And the Australian Air Force is also going through a lot of revolution. And we are also getting in the unmanned aircraft systems at the moment, like Quieter, and some of them has got only one intake. And also they have got systems, basically, like stealth paint and things on them. It's not just the damage it can cause, but also compromising the stealth capability of this aircraft if they do get hit by birds, and and then those kind of signatures come up on those airframes. So yeah, we're just looking at it from various angles here. And operationally, they are mission oriented. There's a lot of local trainings conducted on military bases, test flights, low level, high speed maneuvers. Basically, if there's a strike at that time, it doesn't give much sort of redundancy for recovery and stuff. So, just we have to keep that in mind. And aviation ecologists and wildlife management officers are more embedded with the operations. Pilot in command has more flexibility in this case and make choices. They can delay hold position and missed approaches. And insurance and profit, and sometimes, all the, missions are time like basically time limited and basically controlled, but there's some flexibility actually to work around it. Administration wise, it's Military Combat Support Group, CSG, which is Defense Uniform, is the administration side of it. And when you look at Civil Aviation, Civil Estate Infrastructure Group, ENIG, is Defense Civilian. We are talking about all the stakeholders in this program. And Estate Maintenance and Operations Support Contractor, in this case, what we have got at Edinburgh is Ventia, and Subject Matter Experts, which is Aviation. And some of the challenges, Defense is a large organization, so they have got a lot of priorities and, like lots of things happening at the same time. And getting key personnel to understand the integrated nature of the program. What we did find in early days, the difference between pest control versus air operational safety. So, like let's say the uniforms will understand, okay, this is about air operational safety, but if there's not enough advocacy, like, someone looking into a program from just funding point of view, like they wouldn't see this, like that, so those were the challenges. And also personal changeover and change in support services structure. So they did go through a lot of contract changes and stuff on time. So sometimes things like over time, and that sometimes we have to just go and reinstate where things were left by previous organizations, to, or new personnel coming in, just to educate them again about the importance of the program. Postings and deployment of key personnel, and with the Australian Defence Force, one of the key stakeholder of the personnel in this area is the base aviation safety officers, and they have got 2 to 3 year cycles. The first year they come in, learn, pick up the program, they serve for 1 year, they run with it, and then like if they have to move on, there will be someone else coming in, we have to restart this stuff again. So that's why we need like a lot of like clear-cut procedures, processes, so that if someone comes on board, they're inducted and they take things up from where it was left. Roles and responsibilities and communication sometimes can be unclear without a good plan, and Edinburgh has got a wildlife management plan, and some other military bases we have wrote plans for as well. So similarities, basically the fundamentals of science is the same when managing ecology of the region or individual species. So to reduce strikes, you have to basically keep the two birds separated. Basically, we do understand basically that military, like in terms of similarity, like with the civil side, the new aircraft are much bigger, they're quieter, they're faster as well. And like instead of turboprop, just like I have, that slide, the photo shows there's a IPC Orion, which is a basically turboprop engine has been replaced by the much quieter P8 Poseidon, so which has got a bigger intake, larger frame, and a lot of sensitive instruments on it. So basically that's making it more prone to strikes and damages, or sometimes we call it like it looks like a vacuum cleaner coming in when there's a lot of birds in the airspace. So and same thing, C-70s, very low set engines and high suction force, which can basically the intake of a bird is pretty higher in those kind of aircraft. So and then just putting into context, like a lot of aircraft certifications, like engine certifications are put through test as well. But what happens in a control environment, and we all know what will happen in an, like we can't predict to that closely what can happen actually in the field scenario, especially if there's less height involved and in the type of maneuver that aircraft is conducting. So just to put into perspective, like for example, 1.8 kg of bird, that is our standard Australian white ibis, the bin chickens you can call them. At relative speed of aircraft relative speed, in this case the bird speed is negligible at basically 300 knots, around about 150 meters per second, which is like average speed of an aircraft within the terminal airspace. Basically can impart more kinetic energy when struck than a 50 caliber sniper round. If some of you guys have got some background on firearms, that's around about 300 feet per second with 13,000 pound force of energy. That's a lot of energy for a bird to strike, like when there's a bird strike. So, and then basically going into the program, so RAF Edinburgh the plan, we have got a management plan, and it has got a management commitment in there. Where there's, like integral is the stakeholders, basically with the Royal Australian Air Force, ENIG, and EMOS contractors. So this model is basically based on the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2011, the safety management system and structure, and comes out of what Defence adopts, which sort of the management plan is aligned with that. So identifying hazards, assessing risk, controlling risk, and reviewing risk, and also maintaining the program. Yeah, thank you. And then basically looking at the risk rank of the species in 2011 and what we are now, a lot of those high risk has dropped. So that means the management has really worked well. Some of them has gone up, but it's not a major concern. But between high and moderate risk species, a lot of things are pretty low. So basically, what I'm getting to, the program has had a lot of success over time, and the model itself involves good communication, reporting, monitoring, and active management, basically dealing with the species directly, and passive management, modifying habitat to actually basically deter the species from the site. And the main element is tactical and operational communication, which is basically the wildlife management officer communicating the risk to the air traffic controllers when the air traffic control is manned, or the pilot if on command directly when it is under CTF. One thing very important we have learned out of this is standard phraseology. So, from a pilot's point of view, and as Brian has mentioned, pilots at this moment, they're not taught about birds, they're taught about weather. So if you tell them there's a west-tailed eagle, which is a call sign for many military aircraft as well, that can be a little bit confusing to a pilot in command. All you can say is, to maintain, standard phraseology, and also the way it is reported. You have to tell the pilot from a pilot's point of view, where he's sitting. So basically telling them the direction in o'clock, distance in meters, when it's short distance and involved in aviation, and height in feet above ground level. So, unless you've got an avian radar or something, you cannot talk nautical miles, because as a wildlife management officer with limited capability, you cannot see that far. A lot of reporting is involved, ESA, NOTAMs, air terminal information systems. We release wildlife hazard notification. There's an example of that over there, and also management plan updates. So where I'm getting to, I guess, is sort of, on the active management approaches, which is most airports use these techniques and stuff. But I think the main ones are going back to the theme collaboration is basically active management, what we achieved in there, off aerodrome. Because if you look at what is happening with Edinburgh, the airspace risk, which is bird transiting over the airspace, hasn't really gone down that much. But the terminal, which is the use of birds in the airside grassland and stuff, that has gone down. But what has happened is just getting collaboration from nearby stakeholders to do something on their property, and some of them even adopted to write a plan and implement that plan, sort of impacts, sort of reduces the risk. A classic example is management of an off-aerodrome site, like Silver Gull management at a North Adelaide at a facility, which is a waste transfer station, North Adelaide Waste Management Authority. So we started that program in 2012. Whenever the Silver Gull risk goes up, we release a notice and we talk to the stakeholder. They implement the program just to deter gulls from the site, and it sort of drops down, and it impacts the airside infringements as well. So, so getting back to other things, as I said, it's a big organization. So, Ventia has got a hydrozone management plan. So a lot of ecology involved here. So that plan actually is compliant with the wildlife hazard management plan. The risk species, the plant species has been assessed to see if they can attract wildlife risk or not. And they are planted in a way, for hydrozoning is basically putting plants in for similar water requirement, more resilient species from the same region, native sort of flora we are talking about. And the plan also has got grass management schedule, which the land management personnel from Ventia has taken up. So that basically says how to actually mow, during aircraft operational period to keep the risk low. And that has actually worked when the grass height management and changes has been happening, like from 2011 to now. Basically, we can see a lot of grassland species decreases. So sometimes we have to apply, we raise the grass height, basically around sort of end of basically around sort of winter and spring, just to deter certain species, and like the most of the high and moderate risk species, and basically compared to what was happening in 2011, and that has been working. And also, I think the main thing is where we are thinking about going from here, and this is our future recommendation. This is not a military commitment at this stage. So moving on from here is basically we're talking about the stage 4 of the program, which is extended separation approach. That is integration and application of technology. That means real-time and local regional forecasting, reporting and avoidance system with cross-disciplinary integration and cost sharing. Because some of these species we are talking about, it's not only aviation issue, it's primary industries issue, tourism issue as well, just like little corals, sort of damaging vineyards and orchards and stuff around the region. So basically using radar in aeroecological monitoring, looking at terminal and beyond terminal airspace up to 10 nautical miles approach cycle. This radius includes all the airspace where an aircraft is likely to be in the strike zone below 3,000 feet AGL. And then just getting back to what I mentioned earlier is the radar setup at RAF Edinburgh. So basically my squadron leader, Bruce Preston at that time was the BISO. So we set up a basic radar to actually see where the silver gulls are coming from and going to. And actually, and then the way we looked at this is the transits of those gulls at that time. And then what we captured is this track. So it wasn't the best technology, but it was very basic. But we did track the silver gulls, just looking at the runway there, Edinburgh runway, and then we could track them to where they were terminating, and then we drove around and checked what this facility was, and we saw all the gulls over there. So that was a very basic thing which worked, and it is still sort of giving us the outcome we need. And there's advanced technologies out there, a lot of radar systems, with new technologies. Robin has got, SEPTA has got sort of, avian radars. Basically, they are tailored for these kind of programs. And then basically, if you look at the basic model, like, just like a basic avian sort of radar imagery of the airspace surrounding airport, this is what you see. So, the color codes are basically the bird targets. So the yellow ones are moderate risk, the red ones are high risk targets. But what happens, like you got so many of this going on, what does it mean? Like how can it be translated as a useful basically information? Because in the end, we have to understand technology gives great data sources, but how do we actually translate this data into usable information, both strategically and technical, is the other question. Because everyone is selling technology, but basically what it has to be done is the technology and the data has to be translated into useful information. A classic example which we did find, so there's a number of radars, like we have talked about the Robin system, SEPTA has got it there, but there's another one called passive radar in this example. And this is basically, and we can develop this in Australia, basically, which is operating from a passive sensor. So they've got basically normal radar output, tracks and detections, basically 360 degrees surveillance, and then significantly lower cost. So, we have got all the stuff we need out there, but I think we just have to sort of sit down, develop algorithms, and then, trial and implement something in defense aviation space and also in civil space. So as I said, there's a lot of technologies out there. We just have to sort of take them on board and implement that in a more strategic and tactical way. So as I mentioned, just wrapping this up, what we need is, good data, information, interpretation of that information, and good policies to actually change those, into actions. And this is what I'm showing, like something as a fully integrated model, which is the future. And I think I'll wrap that up if, for now. And there's a summary I provided what all this is about. It's about good engagement. It's about good communication. Everything has to be dynamic and adaptive, and integration and application of technology is the future for the ownership, basically ownership in pursuit of excellence for these programs. Thanks, Brian. That's it for me.
Thanks, Raphael. Sorry we had to cut you a bit short there, but hopefully you'll be able to share your full presentation with everybody. We can put it onto our site, and then people can come and look at it. So another superb example of collaboration. When I'm doing training to pilots, one of the things I emphasize is that speed kills. And one of the initiatives that Bruce McKinnon brought into Canada was 250 knots below 10,000. And I always encourage people to do that because, as you said, half mv squared doesn't go away. And the slower speed you can have, the less is going to be the impact. I also like the idea of having a wildlife officer involved in ATC controller training, a really, really good start. And again, seeing the initiatives in Indonesia, and what we're trying to push for here is that we need wildlife training with the pilots as well. Again, thank you for promoting standard phraseology. It's another issue that the World Bird Strike Association, LITA, and others are working with, and also the AAWHG is advocating. And if you want to see some examples of it, please go to our recommended practices, where we have RPs on both terminology and phraseology. I don't know, Raphael, if you're aware, but there's a risk assessment working group. Jeff McGee was the founder of this, or worked with other people to found it. It meets regularly. And you probably remember from his webinar, the first webinar, he was talking about an area which is very similar to the one you're talking about. And we're looking at the 10 nautical mile, 3,000 feet, basically something that would be similar to the obstacle clearance limit, and trying to work and give alerts to pilots inside that, and also to have controllers be able to work with the pilots to ensure that the aircraft doesn't meet the bird in that airspace. And part of that obviously is the introduction of radar. You mentioned the great work done by Bruce Preston. You're probably aware that he did win an award here from the AAWHG for that work. And I certainly would love to see avian radar being used more for strategic and eventually for tactical mitigation. So just a couple of questions before I let you go and we move on to Dan. You showed the differences between civil and military airports and the success you've had at RAF Edinburgh and also some of the other bases. But two questions: how does this work, or can it work at a joint user base? For those of you outside Australia, we have a number of airports which operate both military and civil operations. And the second question is, can the same approach work at civil airports? Having been in the military where you're told to do something, it's not quite the same in the civil world. So could you just answer those questions before we move on?
Yes, Brian. And I think when we talk about collaboration and stakeholder sort of engagement at a joint user aerodrome, it can work. So basically what we have to have is currently they have got airport safety officers or aerodrome reporting officers which will do a multitude of tasks. So there's no tailored sort of program. But if you look, like officer, but if there's a shared responsibility and shared resourcing and a tailored wildlife management officers, I think that's better, because if what will happen, like, it's just like you wouldn't get sort of, like a brain surgeon to actually conduct a heart surgery. That is the concept here. So, it's in the end, it's such a specialized area that, and if you look at the damage cost involved, the capability cost involved, I think if even joint users goes with, like a shared resource between military and civil, like which is happening a lot more with the integration of DESA 139 with CASA 139, like we're integrating everything. So why not even resource sharing in that case, just to have, wildlife management officers and subject matter experts. And with the civil side of it as an aerodrome, I think, as I said, the fundamentals of aviation wildlife risk management, ecology, and the bird behavior and the speed involved of an aircraft, and with the modern aircraft type, which is quite similar, a Boeing aircraft from, basically from a civil sort of operation to military, is not much difference. So I think the only thing would be the time limitation for all this stuff, but it's no different, as you guys said before, more holding fuel, understanding the risk and appreciating that risk as well. Because like the main factor with civil is they're quite busy and time pressed. But trying to justify that to the insurer, or if there's or there's a lot of injury, or in the worst case scenario, fatality. So I think basically like having controllers and less pressure on an ARO, just trying to do everything from port checks to runway inspections to other stuff, gate control and everything. I think tailored sort of, especially staff will sort of assist this, because in the end, the risk will not go down. It is increasing in the airspace. So we got more aircraft, quiet aircraft. Plus also, if you look at all the environmental and ecological sort of, like times we are going through with the, we are into extended La Nina condition now with native Indian dipole in this region, which is affecting the amount of, like wildlife in the airspace. That's not going to go down. So why should we be cutting back on the resourcing to actually manage this risk? So I think, yes, the answer is that it can work. There has to be basically some tailoring in both cases.
Okay, thank you very much, Raphael. Please stay on the line, and we'll give you some questions at the end. So our next presenter, Dan Parsons, will present on wildlife hazard event reporting improvements, which for the eagle-eyed of you is a different title to the one he originally submitted. Dan tells me this presentation is very similar, but some of the changes are extremely nuanced. Without giving away any of the surprises, I should warn you that he'll be using a novel approach, perhaps inspired by Andrew's use of the Simpsons analogies last week, and there will be polling during his presentation, so stay alert and be ready to answer. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you, everybody. Yes, my name is Dan Parsons. I'm a PhD research candidate at Central Queensland University, and at times also a bit of a curious nerd that blogs on the runwaycenterline.com. Now, today I want to talk about my PhD research project, and it's a rather high-level concept, and so, of course, I'd love to kick that off by talking about baseball. Excuse me. Not real baseball, but a baseball movie at least. And this particular scene at the start of this movie resonates a lot with me, having sat in many risk assessment workshops. And the scene involves Brad Pitt's character, who's the general manager of a baseball team, talking to his scouting group about replacing a couple of players that they've lost to the New York Yankees. Now, this group of men, 3 of them there on the left and about another 6 or 7 in the room, they're talking a lot of baloney, really. A bunch of baseball-related stuff, a lot of non-baseball related stuff. And Brad Pitt gets a little sick of the talk and interjects with a rather dismissive comment that all you guys do is talk. Now, this gets the ire of the chief scout here in the purple shirt, and he throws it back at Billy as well. Contribute. Tell us what you think. And he almost dismissively comes back to them again and saying, well, you guys, all you do is talk. You're not even looking at the problem. And this is the bit that resonates with me, and I'm sure with many others that have sat in risk assessment workshops where we're talking probably at cross purposes. And this discussion I quite like, because Billy challenges his team. Then he says, well, what's the problem? And then you get this evasive conversation starts. Well, we all know what the problem. And Billy comes back with, great, tell me what the problem is. And one last crack at probably avoiding actually speaking the problem out loud, the chief scout responds with, we all know what the problem is. But then he tries to articulate what the problem is. And he gets a pretty dismissive note from Billy, that's not the problem. The next guy along tries to articulate the problem. Nope, same answer. Another one attempts, and in the end, Billy has to respond with what he sees as the general manager. Now, of course, his explanation is baseball related, and we're here to talk about wildlife hazard management. And often we probably feel that we've got a pretty good handle on what the problem is. In fact, just last week I came onto this same forum and I spoke about how COVID caused an increased risk to our problem through the very use of wildlife strike statistics. But perhaps that's not the full picture. And as maybe a little bit of a test of this, I'd love to go through a little polling exercise with everybody here. So on the screen in front of you in the on-air polling system, just on to the right, which I think is that side for everybody. If you can't see the polls as they come up. There should be a little drop-down box for you there to see them. Now, this is not an official poll. I'm not going to take this data and publish it. I haven't received ethics approval or anything like that. This is just for fun, perhaps, if you have the same sense of fun as me. What I'm going to present to you are 5 different scenarios. You don't play a particular role in any one of these scenarios, but just the scenario overall, I'm going to ask you to score the highest level you think this situation should be recorded or reported to. So if you think this is just something that you don't need to record or report, just move on, just part of normal activity, then please just score it a 1. If you think this is something that you should just record maybe in a diary or a daily log sheet, nothing that you'll really analyze statistically, score a 2. If you think it should be to the organizational level in some form of database, a 3. If you think it should go up to the national level, 4. And if you think it should go all the way into the IBIS system at ICAO, please score it a 5. I see a couple of answers already started to come in, but I will talk through the scenario just for everybody else. So this particular scenario is we have a bird carcass found on the runway. After a series of takeoffs, the carcass appears disfigured, but there have been no reports from any of the aircraft departing that they suffered a strike. So we might just take another 10 seconds or so to get a few more answers in and see what people think about this particular scenario. Where should this be reported to? I'll give people 5 more seconds to jump in there. Okay, thank you very much, everybody that's responded. We'll just end it there and we'll share the results. And okay, we've got a bit of a mix. Glad to see that everybody wants to see it recorded. There are some regulations perhaps around this, although it's not always clear, cut and dry. But we have a bit of a mix, a couple of people reporting it all the way internationally, some to national level. Just on about the majority or halfway are reporting this to the organizational level. Let's tweak that scenario a little bit and have a look at the second poll here, which should be open now. All right, very similar scenario, but this time witnesses watch as the bird narrowly misses a departing aircraft on the runway, but the poor fella is caught in the wake turbulence of the aircraft and it hits the ground. The bird is killed and the carcass appears disfigured, which sounds very similar. So where would you score that one? At what level would you record this particular event? Just got a couple of responses coming in now. We'll give it about another 15 seconds. All right, it looks like it's settled down a little bit there. Oh, of course, somebody jumps in. Actually, a pretty similar spread, but we'll cut it there. And Catherine will share those results. We've got it, and we can see a pretty similar spread overall. A couple of people going all the way into the IBIS, but that vast majority around the organizational level there. But a pretty good mix of responses. Let's go with another scenario here. So scenario 3, if you scroll down, has just been shared. This time we've got an aircraft on final approach. The airside safety officer notices a flock of ducks have encroached into the runway strip. Now she informs the aircraft and the crew elect to go around. The airside safety officer then jumps on the runway strip, clears it, and then the crew rejoins the queue and they land about 15 minutes later than they were expecting. How would you see that one recorded or reported? Okay, I can see the responses coming in there. I don't want to tease you with what the results are, but a little bit more consensus on this one. I thought this one might have blown it out a little bit more, but another couple of seconds just to see if there's any stragglers. Even if you didn't vote on the first 2, feel free to jump in now and add your voice if some of these scenarios you feel pretty strongly about, or even if you don't. Okay, we'll end that one there and we'll share those results. Okay, so a heavy majority into the organizational level. They want to see this reported organizationally. Maybe 1 or 2 at the international level, which is quite interesting. And a few just want to see that on the daily record sheet. So not necessarily to be used as part of statistical analysis later. Now I've tweaked it again for scenario 4, so we'll get that one running. This time the aircraft's a little bit further out. It's about 10 miles out. The airside safety officer notices that same flock of ducks. Actually, this is a different safety officer. They've noticed the ducks are on the runway strip, and this time the reporting officer enters the runway strip to harass the birds. The arriving aircraft has just heard that call. They haven't been communicated to, and they've elected to hold out away from the aerodrome until the birds and the safety officer are clear of the runway strip. And again, there's about a 15-minute delay due to this particular hold. How would you guys record that or report that? I think you've got the hang of it now, so we'll just do another couple of seconds. Oh, there was a late flurry there, but I think we'll end it there so we can try and get back on time and then share the results. So there we go. And so again, a heavy majority on the organizational level capture. A few want to put this at the international level, and a couple are also just trying to record this in the daily schedule. We'll do one more scenario and we'll get that. Oh, sorry about that. Too many screens going at this time. So that one's open. This time, the airside safety officer notices a flock of ducks have arrived at a pond outside the runway strip, but just next to it. There is an aircraft on final, but this time the reporting officer doesn't act. They don't want to risk the birds getting spooked and flying into the aircraft while it's in the vicinity. How would the participants here rate that particular scenario? I saw a couple of votes go into number 2, and I thought it was going to stay there and everyone was going to be on the same page, but now it's moving around a little bit. It's quite interesting. It looks like it's fairly stable there, so we might end that. Thank you to everybody who participated. And then we'll share those results as well. And quite a bit of a disparity, almost even footing on just recording that particular event on the daily log sheet versus putting it into the organizational level report. Now, I had to prep this slide before knowing what the results would be, and I had to prepare that perhaps everybody in Australia was on the same page, but we were not. If we were, then perhaps we should run the world. But as it is, we're much like many other forums that discuss this particular issue. We've got some work to do. And that's because when we get into groups and we try and talk about the problem, it descends into a bit of a discussion sometimes, much like in the baseball movie that I mentioned before. And so I think there's some work that needs to get done here. The reasons why I think there's a few issues, I've put them into 2 main categories, but I'm sure there's many others. The first one is that probably the one we're most familiar with when talking about the weaknesses of bird strike data is risk management related. We're aware that bird strikes on their own don't necessarily represent the risk posed by the wildlife at any given aerodrome. We take, for example, many strikes involving small birds versus few strikes involving large birds like pelicans, then we get a different picture of risk that is different to the strike data on its own. The other aspect, and hence the picture there, is accident causation models that we have, where we recognize that the few significant strike events we have, which are the pinnacle of the iceberg, tend to represent just that aspect we can see, and that under the surface lies many hazardous situations that went unactioned, many near-miss events that were not recorded and actioned as well. So we've got these potential issues with wildlife strike data just representing the problem on its own. On the other side, I think there's the potential for, in the future, as we get particularly better at wildlife hazard management, now that I think in some jurisdictions we've gotten very good at the reporting side of things, is that if we start to actually succeed in some areas, we may see wildlife strike data come down and we might think we are being successful. But for example, if the research that Isabel Metz is doing in Germany becomes particularly successful and air traffic control alerting systems become great at avoiding strikes, we may see strike rates go down and hail that as a success. But perhaps some people in our industry won't be particularly happy with the additional holding, the additional fuel burn, the additional delays that might also introduce into the system. And therefore, that is something that wildlife hazard management needs to contribute to improving. What I hope to at least contribute to potentially solving this problem, or at least moving it in the right direction, is my PhD program, which is a two-phase approach, at least at this stage. The first stage is what we call a Delphi Survey. That involves a limited number of industry experts, somewhere between 10 and 20, and then in a completely anonymous forum going through a polling system, much like we just went through. Over and over again, we can hopefully get to a consensus, and by being anonymous, we can take ego and honor and saving face out of the equation and just try and hone in on the good and the bad arguments as to why some things should be recorded and perhaps why other things should not be. Now, the second phase is going to try and make that realistic, because the experts might come up with a fantastical model about how to record 1,000,001 different things about the wildlife hazard problem, but that might not be viable. So I want to take that model out to a broader section of the industry, probably aerodrome operators as a nice section of a single population, and ask them how viable the recording and capturing of some of that data will be. That will also be an anonymous survey, but that will just be a single round to validate what the experts come up with. And as Brian mentioned, where I would love the outcome for this project to land is in the IBIS manual, so ICAO's manual on international reporting of bird strikes, which is currently going through an update at the moment, and I'm part of that team and hopefully can insert the results of this study into that particular document. And even though that document is ostensibly just about the IBIS system, it does tend to flow down into national reporting systems and even aerodrome reporting systems as well. And if that all goes well, then hopefully we get a better picture of the bird problem. Perhaps not as scary as Mr. Ostrich there, but a better picture overall of what we need to do and what we can do and what success looks like in wildlife hazard management. And for me personally, hopefully I will graduate with a PhD. Why I'm mentioning this is because I'll be putting out some calls to action in 2020 to get some help from perhaps many participants here in these webinars, either firstly in the Delphi study of experts, which I'm hoping to put out an expression of interest in early 2022 to be part of that study. And then later in 2022, after the experts have sort of come to an agreement on what would be good for us to capture in this space, going out to aerodrome operators in Australia and perhaps some other people as well to get an idea on the viability of that particular model. If you're particularly interested in the way this project is shaping up at the moment, you're more than welcome to follow my journey on the runwaycenterline.com. I haven't really started blogging about my PhD on that platform just yet, but I will when it gets a bit closer to becoming a little bit more official. And if you have any questions or comments today, please feel free to throw it into the Q&A box below or off to the side, and we'll get to it at the end of the panel. But thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Dan. Dan has a very wide aviation background, and as you heard, he's a self-confessed nerd and blogger. And maybe this is why I can put across statistical and other concepts in such an understandable and entertaining way. I should mention I'm a long-term supporter of the Boston Red Sox. You remember in the film, he was offered a job there and turned it down, sadly. And I actually watched them at the famous Fenway Park, holy ground there. Homer hit, during the time there was a Homer hit, means the person hit over the Green Monster, which is a huge wall in part of the park. And they went on in 2004 to win the World Series and get over the curse. For those of you familiar with the world of baseball, you understand. Dan, I mentioned that BA, they have a very successful flight data monitoring program. One of the early ones, they've worked with the UK CAA for a long time, and they developed a severity index using an expert group and putting questions based on the nuclear industry model. And from that, they determined, is a GPWS warning will pull up? What are we going to do that? What happens if you're slightly fast on approach? What happens if you're fast at 500? So you may already be aware of that, but they might be somebody or an organization worth contacting in terms of what you're about to do. So I'm just going to ask you one quick question, and then maybe Thomas can pick it up also when he's doing his presentation. How do we get consistency in local, national and global reporting? Because as we can see from your questions, there is, even amongst a group like this, quite a wide range of thoughts and opinions.
I think probably the first thing is that the standards need to be a bit clearer. So at the moment, and quite rightly, Annex 14 is very broad in saying that wildlife strikes should be reported. What is a strike does at first glance seem pretty simple, but then like the scenarios mentioned earlier, scenario number 2 is often referred to as a vortex strike, yet no collision has actually occurred. Then we get into some national level regulations and guidance material that then start talking about suspected strikes, but with no real clarity on what a suspected strike is. Is that an unconfirmed strike versus confirmed? So it comes down to a bit of that phraseology argument, I think, in the first instance. Once, I guess, we get over that hurdle, or perhaps concurrently, we have the big hurdle now and always of identification of bird species, which are quite essential to some very thorough analyses of bird strike data or hazard event data. That will be one that we'll have to tackle overall, and then just generally promoting and making it simple for people to report. I think that's a real big one. The simpler we can make reporting, the better chance we've got of getting as much data as we can.
Great, thank you. And please stay on the line for some questions at the end. Thanks again, Dan. Our last presentation is from Dr. Thomas Lenny from the Atsb, and it follows on nicely from what Dan just said there. Thomas has spent many years in collating and analysing data for the Australian Wildlife Strike Report, and I've had the privilege of knowing Thomas during most of this time and have seen the development of the ATS Wildlife Striking Report from a document to an interactive website. So following up from what Dan was saying, it's much easier now to make a report in Australia than it was a few years back. Much of this has been Thomas's work, this development into interactive website. And for those who have not seen his presentation before, you'll be envious of the information available to us in Australia to assist with knowing what are the specific wildlife at each location, thus allowing us as stakeholders and other stakeholders to be better able to assess the risk and mitigate it appropriately. So on that note, over to you, Thomas. Thank you.
Okay, well, good morning. My name's Thomas. I'm one of the investigators at the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. So today I'm going to be giving you a very brief overview of ATSB, what we do and how we do it. I'll talk about Australian wildlife strike reporting requirements. I'll give you an overview of the Australian data as well as some updates regarding our reporting and our database, and show you where to find further information and access to our databases on our website. So the Australian Transport Safety Bureau are an independent Commonwealth Government statutory agency. We evolved more or less out of an organisation called BASI, the Bureau for Air Safety Investigations. In 2013, we were established by the Transport Safety Investigations Act of 2013. And it's under the provisions of this Act that we conduct our investigations. We're governed by a commission and operate entirely separately from any transport regulators, policymakers, service providers, or policing agencies. Our primary objective is to improve the safety of and public confidence in Australian transport in the aviation, maritime and rail sectors. And we do this primarily through the independent investigation of transport accidents and other safety occurrences, as well as recording safety data and doing analysis and research on that data and fostering safety awareness, knowledge and action. So in Australia, when aviation occurrences happen, the mandatory reporting requirement is to the ATSB. This is outlined in the TSI Act of 2003. the regulations to that, the TSI regs, which have just been updated. This document has all of the pertinent definitions that you'll need. It defines what are immediately reportable matters. It defines those occurrences which are routine reportable matters, which would constitute the vast majority of wildlife strikes. And it defines what a wildlife strike is. And the definition is quite straightforward. It's when an aircraft collides with an animal, including a bird. For us, that includes any report from aircrew reporting that they felt or saw or smelt, which they do if there's an engine ingestion, a bird strike, even if there's no evidence collected as part of that notification, that counts for us. Likewise, we'll also include reports when airside operators retrieve a carcass from a runway, even if there is no aircraft immediately associated with that. We also record occurrences where evidence of a bird strike is found on an aircraft during a pre or post-flight inspection, and also if evidence is found during maintenance particularly of an engine ingestion. So it's easy to get bogged down in the nuance of what is or isn't a bird strike, but we're collecting this information for the purposes of improving transport safety. So we do cast a fairly wide net. Most of the operators tend to appreciate this, and we do have an excellent reporting culture in Australia, particularly with regard to bird strikes. So as well as defining what needs to be reported, the regs also define who needs to report. And that can include any member of the crew of the aircraft involved in the occurrence, the owner or operator of the aircraft, any persons providing ATT service, anyone providing aerodrome fire or rescue service, anyone providing maintenance or ground personnel, anyone from the regulator CASA, or the aerodrome operator. So we can see there's a wide variety of people reporting to us, and we do get multiple reports pertaining to the same occurrence. This is particularly true for bird strikes. Up to about 40% of our bird strikes will have multiple reports associated with them. And that is fantastic because reports from aircrew will typically have very detailed information about the operation, the aircraft type, etc. But often they have very little opportunity to identify what the bird is that was struck. The opposite is true from ground crew. They'll often have no information about the aircraft involved, but they'll often provide much more detailed information regarding the species involved. So these reports are married up, the information concatenated and merged into the same occurrence as part of our QA processing. There's a number of different ways to report to us. I think it's still technically possible, but in general, we're paper free. We don't really get many mail or faxes anymore. For the immediately reportable matters, these are the accidents typically, which typically aren't bird strikes in Australia. We do have a 24-hour 1-800 hotline during business hours. This is staffed by our safety reporting officers. And then after hours, it's staffed. We have a rotating roster for the investigators to take those calls. We can submit by email. The vast majority of individual reports will be done by an online web form. It's worth noting here that we're in the process of undertaking a once-in-a-decade upgrade to our investigation management system. Concurrent with that, we are also updating our website. And with that, again, is coming a new version of the online web reporting form. We should see this coming live in November this year. I understand that this will streamline even more the reporting process, particularly for bird strikes, which are our most frequently reported occurrence type. But for wildlife strikes, the vast majority of reports come through by application programming interface. So these are essentially semi-automated processes that pushes data out of operators' databases to us, but still requires some manual handling at our end. So all of the major or the large operators that are maintaining their own database tend to do it this way. So to streamline that process even further, and minimize the manual handling at our end as well. Several years ago, we did implement an XML schema, and this essentially helps operators push data automatically out of their databases. It then transforms it into the format required by our database and then puts it into our database with no manual handling, significantly streamlining the process. This has been used successfully by one major capital airport for several years now. It will need to be updated with our new reporting forms, but will be available to any operators that would like to use that. So as well as being the National Independent Investigator, we are also the custodians of Australia's National Aviation Occurrence Database. And there's a few things we do with that data. Internally, we use it for trend detection and analysis. This can help identify areas of concern, which can in turn help direct or drive systemic research investigations, or what we call safety studies. And we can use the data to also provide background and context to occurrence investigations. Externally, for our main aviation data set, we provide monthly summaries to airline operators so that they can have the opportunity to compare their record against ours and correct the record where appropriate. For some years now, we've also maintained a searchable online database. So this is our main aviation database that has all the occurrence types, not just bird strikes. Up till, well, currently, it outputs something similar to what you can see there. But along with the new website, early next year, we can expect to see an update to that going live. So all of that's going to be now based on a Microsoft Power BI dashboard system, like what was introduced to our wildlife strike database in 2018. So this should hopefully provide users better access to the data. So for the wildlife strike data, there's a few other things that we do. We provide monthly summaries to Aerodromes. This is an opt-in service. We currently send out summaries to about 30 aerodromes. Any aerodrome that would like to be added to the list is welcome to email in and request access to that. This gives the aerodromes an opportunity to compare their records with ours and correct the record if necessary. Oftentimes, we'll get follow-up updates from the aerodromes with species identifications from DNA analysis. So we find this to be a really useful collaborative method of enriching our data set. So we also produce a wildlife strike report. As Brian mentioned in the intro, that used to be a paper-based report. It's moved to an online interactive dashboard sort of report to give people better access to the data. Concurrent with that, we also provided the raw data itself. So we now publish our wildlife strike data set in its entirety for people to download and interrogate. So we have time for a quick look at the Australian data. So typically, on average, we might get about 16,000 notifications to the Atsb per year. About 3,000 of these or so would pertain to bird strikes. But as discussed, about 40% or so of these would relate to the same occurrence. So that gives us, on average, anywhere between about 1,600 and 1,900 individual bird strike occurrences reported to us per year. They remain our most frequently reported occurrence type, and in the 10 years leading up to 2020, we've had 16,875 bird strikes reported to us. However, the vast majority of these, 99.85%, are classified as incidents, with about 0.01% classified as serious incidents, whilst 0.14% of these over the 10 years are classified as accidents. We have digital records going back over 100 years now, and in that time we've had no civilian fatalities associated with a bird strike. In the 10-year reporting period up to 2020, about 0.05% of bird strikes result in injury to a human, with 8 injuries over the 10 years. And again, the vast majority have either no or nil damage reported to the aircraft. In the 10-year period, however, we have had 8 aircraft destroyed by birds or as a result of a bird strike. 7 of these were RPAS, otherwise known as drones. The other one was, from memory, a Robertson R-22. So to help give you some context, I guess, and what keeps us busy most of the time is that in the same 10-year period, we've had 247 fatal accidents in aviation in Australia. So from the point of view of transport safety in Australia, bird strikes have fortunately been a very high frequency but low risk occurrence. We know, however, from international experience that bird strikes are potentially one of those occurrence types that could result in a whole loss of an RPT, a high cap aircraft, which is one of the reasons we continue to monitor them so carefully. We have time for a very brief look at the data. Here we see the 10 years leading up to 2020, which is the data that will be released in November. And we see on average, we typically have anywhere between about 1,600 and 1,900 bird strikes reported to us per year in Australia. 2020 was down by pretty much exactly a third to 1,159, and no prizes really for guessing why that was. So if we look at the species most commonly struck in Australia over that 10-year period, we see that the most frequently struck bird in Australia isn't actually a bird, it's the flying fox and others reported in that aggregated group, followed by kites, swallows, martins, black-winged plovers and galahs. As Brian touched on at the beginning, for ease of presentation, what we've got here are the aggregated groupings. There are dozens of ways in which these things are individually reported to us. In our online database, we do provide the full fidelity, so you can drill down into the 12 or so different ways that lapwings and plovers are reported to us, if that's useful to you. If you'd like to get further access to the data, I don't have time to go into the Power BI dashboards today, but if you'd like to access them. So from our main website, this is the main occurrence database. This is the one that has all occurrence types, not just the bird strikes. You can access that down on the bottom right-hand side. This is the one that's going to be updated in January to incorporate the interactive dashboards. If you're interested in the wildlife strikes, navigate to the aviation statistics and find the last report. The report that is there now has data up to and including 2017. The next report will have data up to and including 2020. The data is finalized, the dashboard's made, and we're just pushing it through publication at the moment and should be live in November, but you'll access it at the same spot. When you get there, you'll see that we now provide public access to our animal strike databases in their entirety. So you'll see there 2 Excel files associated with these reports now. If you right click on the bird strikes one and download it, you'll find over 16,500 rows with 37 columns of information, which is literally the entirety of our data set. Likewise, there's another 400 or so rows for the ground-based animal strikes. There's 2 different ways you can view the report. You can view it there in the web browser, and if you scroll down and expand those headings, you will see 8 interactive dashboards, which will give you very good and interactive and customizable access to the data that you're interested in, and you'll then be able to download that specific data. You can also download the PDF report, and embedded in that are those 8 interactive dashboards. Again, I don't really have time to go into them today, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to have a look. And that's really all I have time for. There's links there to the ATSB's website, data requests, go to ATSB info, notifications to ATSB ASIR. Any feedback on the presentation or feedback on what you'd like to go into our wildlife strike reports can come to me for now. Links there to our research publications. The one there now is AR 2018-035, which has data up to 2017. And coming in November, hopefully, should be the new one, AR 2020-050. That's it for me today. I'll try and stick around for the Q&A if I can. Cheers.
Introduction, you can see what an excellent website has been created by Thomas and his colleagues, and the ability to report online. And as he mentioned, we have a very good reporting culture here. I have a question from Dan for you, Thomas. What efforts are being made to collect traffic data involving charter aircraft? Did you hear the question, Thomas?
Yeah, I'm just processing it.
Without notice.
Traffic data. So we're talking about movements. So movements in Australia are reported to the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics. As part of our statistics report, we tend to get movements data and use that as normalizing data to get rates. So you'll see in our online reports, you'll see we process and analyze rates of bird strikes on a per 10,000 movements basis for locations across Australia. But in terms of collecting that data, you'll have to defer those questions to the Department of Infrastructure.
All right, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions here for Sadikin and Yursun before we tie up the session today. If they're ready, standing by to. Okay, thank you. So the first one is from Peter Raven, and the second one is from Jill Briggs. Both Peter and Jill congratulate you on a great presentation, and Jill particularly mentions how great it is to see Indonesia making these fantastic steps towards having a very effective National Bird Strike Committee. So Peter's first says, any significant changes in wildlife activity around airports when volcanic events have been happening? So have you noticed any significant changes in wildlife activity caused by volcanic events? Over to you, Sadikin.
Thank you, Peter, for the question. But actually for that, we haven't got any data because we haven't taken into account for observation. But thank you. Maybe we can put it as a note for us to also include it, the bird activity during the volcano. But I think overall, maybe Yusuf can add on. Surely for any volcanic, it might also affecting birds and also wildlife to be more active when the volcanic to be erupted. Yeah, he is confirming that. So maybe next time we will include it in the deep detail on the observation. Thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you. The next one, as I said, from Jill Briggs. Have you thought of adding TNI -AU to the National Committee?
For that, in the TNI AU, we have been just contacted with the Lieutenant Colonel of Robertus, which I believe he's in the attendees this morning, and we just have a short talk and discussion. Maybe in the future we will include the military air force also in the committee as well. Okay, thank you very much, Terima kasih. I have one more question here for Thomas. I'm just going to read this. This is from Echo. Does the bird strike reports also include those occurrences that has no impact damage on the aircraft? Should a pilot report a bird strike assumption? In other words, we think we hit a bird, but we don't have any direct proof of that. Thomas?
A report of, oh, I'm sorry.
So
to the regs again, any collision between an aircraft and an animal is a reportable occurrence. To a certain extent, we're dependent, not just for bird strikes, but for any occurrence type on a pilot report. If a pilot reports to us that they had an engine failure, we tend to believe them. We don't necessarily require proof of that. The pilot reports to us that they think they hit a bird, they felt a bird strike. We also think that they're right, and we will record that even if there's no evidence. They tend to know what they're doing.
I'm glad this program is recorded, because I think it's the first time anybody's said that the pilot's right. So thank you for that, Thomas. And thank you again for all your hard work. I know you may or may not be staying on the executive, but being here, and I've enjoyed the update, and I know how much work goes each year into producing those reports. So it's just up to me to thank all the presenters for excellent presentations, and also a special mention to Catherine and her colleagues for their amazing assistance. I now hand over control to Ash McAlpine, that well-known ACCO, as was, and our chair, who will make the closing remarks. Over to you, Ash.
Thanks, Brian, and great to see everybody here again. Well, it's been 3 weeks, 6 hours of presentations. We've had 22 speakers, somewhere around 117 attendees from 9 different countries. We've had all states of Australia represented. We've had government and industry, as well as our military. And in fact, military representatives from overseas. Wow. What a 3 weeks it's been. And a big thanks to our friends from all around the world. Given the time zones, and many of us know what time zone meetings in different time zones actually means, and even especially closer to home. Our friends from PNG in Indonesia, been most amazing having you guys along for this webinar series. Our colleagues up in Singapore, and indeed our colleagues across the Pacific, and represented here in this series by PASO themselves. We've had a fantastic contingent on board from India. Big shout out to Bangalore Airport. I think by far and away the greatest group of attendees from one location or one organisation in the webinar series, as well as friends and colleagues from the United States, Canada, indeed Italy, and even Germany. I don't even want to think of what time of the day or night it is there for you guys. Thank you one and all. We started off this webinar series 3 weeks ago with this quote sitting on a screen. In the last 3 weeks, we've heard from all parts of the greater aviation industry on topics various surrounding our broad theme of research and innovation. From the more pure science and research topics of webinar 1 to the amazing session last week facilitated by Mr. Dave Anderson, focusing on the COVID impacts, and of course, very ably facilitated session today led by Captain Brian Greaves, and the topics around collaboration. As the chair of the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group, and on behalf of my amazingly dedicated team, I want to say thank you to you all. But I also most definitely want to single out some of the team for particular mention and for their contribution. I wish we could actually embarrass them and get them to stand up in an audience and applaud them. But unfortunately, one of the most severe limitations of webinars is it's pretty hard to do that. But my sincere thanks and my heartfelt thoughts go out to Margot Marchbank, our communications officer for the executive from Coro Communications. Also Eric Lotoro from Rex Airlines, and his contributions to helping organise the sessions over the last 3 weeks, and indeed the planned event before that. And most especially, and last but definitely not least, Jill Bricks from Avashore, a long-time bastion of the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group executive, a past chair of the group, a member of the exec from nearly as far back as I can remember, somebody who's in virtually every meeting without fail, and largely responsible for the event organising, both for our planned event in Adelaide that we unfortunately had to reconsider, but also then converting it to this webinar series today. These three, this dynamic trio, without whom we wouldn't have none of what you've hopefully enjoyed over the last 3 weeks, and none of the information that has now been recorded and will be able to be absorbed by your organisations in the future going forward after we repost them up. Before I call this a wrap, I'd like to give you my thoughts on where I would like us all to set our sights, be our role in government or in industry, be our roles at an airport, in operations, in air traffic management, aviation operations, maintenance, or even the science and research side of things. I think most ably summarized by Sadikin and Team Indonesia this morning with the slide that they put up entitled Uniting Puzzles, the Holistic Approach to Collaboration. It very much reminded me of the International Airways Volcanic Watch and amazingly uncolluded question from Peter Raven there about volcanoes. But it's very, very clear in the ICAO documentation of how all the parts of the system contribute to the system outcomes. And it's not left to one particular organization. And I think Sadikin's diagram on the screen showed exactly the same sort of concept and where we can be looking at. The future and beyond. So firstly, I would like to see wildlife hazard management practices become normal in all domains. Just as weather or other hazards, including volcanic ash, are treated by all the different elements of aviation. We all have a role to play. I would like us to accept that we all have responsibility, and by contributing to the system and sharing in that responsibility, we will also collectively share in the outcome, an outcome we would all actually relish having in this case. I'd like to see a rebalance in responsibilities, with air operators accepting greater responsibility for the application of risk management, including risk assessment. It's an interesting one when you think back to the Concorde disaster. I think it'd be unimaginable for anybody to think of an air traffic control officer being aware of that FOD on the runway and simply saying to the pilot, are you happy to land or take off? And yet we do still have instances at times of wildlife being known to be in the landing zone of a runway, and then the information is simply passed to the pilots for them to make the decision. I'd like to see the ATM and the air traffic controllers of the world not only be responsible for passing information, but also at times for making very active decisions with a safety basis. Airports and aerodromes, I'd like to see you guys being more focused on the hazard and the threat assessment and management space, rather than shouldering an unfair responsibility for the assessment of risk, which has to be, in fact, integrated into an operation of an airline or an air operator before it can be assessed. But ultimately, let's never lose sight of the outcome that we are mutually all seeking, and that's the minimization, if not the elimination, of all avoidable wildlife hazard strikes in aviation. So on that note, and before I call the 2021 webinar series a close, and in fact, I'll be so bold as to say an overwhelming success, I'd like to please put a plug in for the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group. I'd like to ask everybody, grab your phones now, hit that QR code, no matter where you are in the world. I think we've all been pretty good at that. That'll take you to our LinkedIn page. Give us a follow on there. Social media stuff counts, but that's also where you'll find the events and the happenings of the Australian Aviation Wildlife Group in the most timely way, or of course our website itself. Things to stay tuned for in the not too distant future will be the announcement of our annual industry awards. We were hoping to do it during this webinar series, but it just didn't work out, and it's somewhat impersonal trying to do the presentation of a very well-deserved award over a webinar. So we'll hold that one off for now and see if we can come up with a more appropriate and personal way of doing it, if not a more focused way. Also, some of you may have known that we had the photo competition with some fantastic prizes, wildlife-related photos. We'll have the announcement of that coming up at some point too. And finally, as always, the updates and additional recommended practices as they are in continuous improvement within the group, and we're adding to them all the time. So folks, on that note, thank you for the last 3 weeks. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for persevering with the challenges of bandwidth and connections and popping internet signals, and for me, my VPN kicking in randomly. I thank you all very much from the bottom of all of our hearts, and we hope to stay in contact and see you guys all in the future. Bye-bye.